Before we
Thank you so
begin,
much
let
for
me ask you
saving
something.
me.
When was the last time someone stayed?
You're too late.
Not because they had to.
Get well
Not
soon.
because there was something in it for them. But just because leaving never crossed their mind. That question is going to mean everything by the time this story is over. So settle in. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that gets under your skin and stays there long after it ends. He had $340 million in the bank, a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Nashville skyline, a company that employed over 4,000 people, and a name that opened every door in every room he ever walked into. And on a cold Tuesday night in November, he was lying upside down in a crumpled Honda Civic on a rain-soaked highway, bleeding from a gash above his left temple, with no one coming for him. No assistant. No security team. No girlfriend. Nobody. Just the rain hammering the broken windshield and the slow realization that for all his money, all his power, all his carefully constructed life, he was completely and utterly alone. And the only person who stopped, the only person who ran toward that car instead of away from it, was a 29-year-old homeless woman named Ruby Hayes who had less than $12 to her name and nowhere to sleep that night. She pressed her jacket against his wound. She checked his breathing the way her nursing school professors had trained her to. She screamed at the top of her lungs until a passing truck driver finally stopped and called for help. And when the ambulance pulled away and the paramedics asked for her name and address, she gave them her first name, turned up her collar, and walked back out into the rain. She did not wait for a thank you. She did not expect one. That is the kind of person Ruby Hayes was. And that, more than anything else in this story, is what makes everything that comes after so extraordinary. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is not important. What is important is this story, and I am going to tell it to you the way it deserves to be told. From the beginning. From the very roots of two lives that had no business intersecting, that were separated by every measure of wealth, status, and circumstance the world uses to keep people apart, and yet somehow, on a rain-soaked Tennessee highway, collided in a way that neither of them was prepared for. Grant Caldwell was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1979. Not the nice part of Dayton. The part where the factory shift changes rattled the windows at 5 in the morning, and the corner store had bulletproof glass at the register. His father, Raymond Caldwell, was a line worker at a steel fabrication plant for 31 years. The man woke up at 4:15 every single morning of Grant's childhood, laced up the same pair of steel-toed boots, drove the same 15-minute route to the plant, and came home smelling of oil and metal and exhaustion. He never complained. Raymond Caldwell was not a man who complained. He was a man who showed up. And that was the single most important lesson he passed down to his two sons. You show up. You do the work. You do not wait for the world to be fair because the world does not owe you fairness. You earn it. Grant's mother, Barbara, worked the overnight cleaning shift at a corporate office park 3 nights a week and spent the other nights raising 2 boys in a 3-bedroom house that always needed something fixed. There was never quite enough money. But there was always food on the table and clean clothes and a mother who sat at the kitchen table and helped with homework even after working all night. Barbara Caldwell was the kind of woman who held everything together with both hands and never once let her children see how heavy it all was. Grant watched her. He watched her every single day. And he made a decision somewhere around the age of 12, standing in that kitchen watching his mother count out grocery money from an envelope, that he was going to build something so solid, so immovable, that nobody in his family would ever have to count out grocery money again. By the time Grant was 19, he had a full academic scholarship to the University of Tennessee, a second-hand laptop he had saved for over 2 summers, and an idea. The idea was not complicated. He had noticed, during the hours he spent helping his mother organize the offices she cleaned at night, that the software systems these companies were using to manage their facilities were outdated, inefficient, and frankly embarrassing for businesses that claimed to be industry leaders. He thought he could build something better. He was right. He spent his sophomore and junior years building a facilities management software platform in the campus computer lab late at night, pitching it to small businesses in the Nashville area on weekends. And by the time he graduated, he had 11 paying clients and a modest, but real monthly revenue. He named the company Caldwell Technologies, which his roommate told him was the most boring name he had ever heard. and Grant told his roommate he was not trying to be interesting. He was trying to be taken seriously. By 27, Caldwell Technologies had grown into a mid-sized regional operation with 63 employees and a new headquarters in Nashville. By 32, they had expanded nationally and taken on venture funding that valued the company at just under $100 million. By 38, after a series of acquisitions and a product expansion into enterprise data management, the company went public. Grant Caldwell became, on paper, one of the wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs in the American Southeast. His face appeared on the cover of a regional business magazine. His father clipped it and taped it to the refrigerator in Dayton. Grant sent his parents enough money to pay off their house, buy a new car, and retire comfortably. Raymond Caldwell cried when he got the check. It was the only time Grant ever saw his father cry. And then came Patrice Lawson. Patrice was a senior marketing executive Grant met at a technology conference in Chicago when he was 39. She was sharp, confident, wickedly funny in small groups, and possessed of the kind of effortless social grace that Grant had never quite managed to develop himself. He had always been more comfortable in a boardroom than at a dinner party, more fluent in spreadsheets than in small talk. Patrice moved through rooms the way water moves, finding every gap, every opportunity, never forced. He was genuinely dazzled by her. They dated for 18 months. He proposed at a quiet dinner, just the two of them, with a ring that a jeweler in Nashville spent 3 months designing. She said yes and held his face in her hands and told him she had never been so sure of anything. He believed her completely. 3 months before their wedding date, Grant flew back early from a business trip to Seattle. A deal had closed ahead of schedule, and he had called Patrice to tell her he was coming home, but she had not picked up her phone. He assumed she was asleep. He let himself into the penthouse quietly, thinking he would leave her a note and sleep in the guest room so as not to wake her. She was not asleep, and she was not alone. The man she was with was Derek Caldwell, Grant's younger brother, the vice president of operations at Caldwell Technologies, who had been given that position by Grant himself, who had been given a generous salary by Grant, who had been given every advantage and opportunity that Grant's success had made possible. Grant stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds. He knew it was 4 seconds because he counted them, which is a thing his brain did under extreme stress, a coping mechanism he had developed as a child during the tenser moments of his parents' financial arguments. He counted to 4. He turned around. He walked back down to the lobby. He sat in the back of his car for 2.5 hours without moving. And then he drove to a hotel, checked in, and lay on top of the covers with his shoes still on until morning. He did not yell. He did not confront them that night. He did not call his mother or his lawyer or his best friend. He lay there, and he thought. And what he thought about was not rage, exactly, though the rage was certainly there, sitting in his chest like a stone. What he thought about was the question that Patrice and Derek together had just answered for him, though he had not known until that moment he had even been asking it. The question was simple. Do these people love me, or do they love what I represent? And the answer, apparently, was sitting there in his own bedroom, fully formed and impossible to argue with. He called off the wedding by email the following morning, 3 sentences, no explanation. He had Patrice's things moved to a storage unit by noon. He did not fire Derek. He promoted him instead, which everyone in the company found baffling and which Derek himself found so uncomfortable that he spent the following weeks walking around the office like a man waiting for an axe to fall. Grant gave no indication that anything was wrong. He went to work. He ran his company. He showed up, because that was what Raymond Caldwell's son did. But something had closed inside him. Quietly, efficiently, the way Grant did everything. A door had been shut and the bolt had been thrown and the key had been thrown away. In the 2 years that followed, Grant Caldwell dated occasionally, always briefly, always ending the same way, with him retreating behind that closed door the moment anyone got close enough to matter. His assistant, a fiercely competent woman named Donna, began screening his calls from well-meaning friends who wanted to set him up. His therapist, who he saw every other Thursday, suggested that his pattern of emotional withdrawal was a protective mechanism that had outlived its usefulness. Grant agreed with her intellectually and continued doing it anyway. He was 43 years old, $340 million wealthy, and lonelier than he had ever been in his life, including the years in Dayton when there was barely enough money to eat. The experiment began, as most of Grant Caldwell's ideas did, at 2 in the morning, alone in his penthouse, with a glass of bourbon and a yellow legal pad. He had come home from another painfully curated dinner party where a woman whose name he had already forgotten had laughed too loudly at everything he said and spent the better part of the evening working the conversation around to his investment philosophy. He had sat across from her and thought, with a clarity that was almost clinical, I cannot tell anymore whether anyone I meet sees me at all. The money had become a kind of fog. It sat around him everywhere he went, distorting everything, making it impossible to read any situation with the accuracy he relied on. He was, professionally, one of the best judges of people he knew. And personally, he had been completely and repeatedly blind. That asymmetry was driving him out of his mind. So he wrote it down. What would happen if I disappeared? Not literally, not forever, but what would happen if Grant Caldwell ceased to exist for a period of time, and in his place, there was just a man, an ordinary man, with an ordinary job and ordinary clothes and no money, no title, no story that preceded him into the room. Would anyone see that person? Would anyone choose that person? The question felt almost embarrassingly vulnerable when he wrote it down, the kind of thing he would never say out loud, not to Donna, not to his therapist, not to anyone. But on paper at 2 in the morning, it was honest. And Grant Caldwell respected honesty more than almost anything. The logistics took 3 weeks to arrange. His head of security, Frank Odom, a former FBI field agent who had worked for Grant for 6 years and who was constitutionally incapable of pretending anything was a good idea when it was not, listened to the full plan with the expression of a man being asked to assist in his own execution. Frank told Grant it was reckless, unprofessional, potentially dangerous, and almost certainly going to end badly. Grant told Frank that he appreciated the feedback and asked him to arrange the staffing agency placement anyway. Frank did it, because that was also what he did. He showed up. The cover was straightforward. A false name, Gary Cole, registered through a third-party janitorial staffing agency that Caldwell Technologies used for overflow building maintenance. Grant would work evening and weekend shifts in his own corporate tower, wearing a uniform that cost $14, pushing a mop past the offices of executives who reported directly to him, eating lunch in the break room on the ground floor, and observing. He cut his own hair shorter, which he had not done since college. He bought 3 sets of work clothes from a discount store on the west side of Nashville. He drove a used gray Honda Civic that Frank sourced from an auction lot and registered to the false identity. He left his watch in the penthouse safe. The first day was almost comedically disorienting. He stood at the service entrance of a building he owned, swiped a keycard with someone else's name on it, and picked up a mop. 3 different people walked past him in the first 10 minutes, including his own director of finance, a man named Steve who had worked for Grant for 9 years, who looked directly at him for a full second and looked away. Grant mopped the hallway and thought, Frank was right and wrong at the same time. Right that this was reckless. Wrong that it was going to end badly. Because what Grant was already learning, in the first hour of the experiment, was something that should have been obvious but somehow was not. He had spent so long being Grant Caldwell that he had forgotten what it felt like to be invisible. And invisibility, it turned out, was clarifying in a way that nothing else had been. He worked the experiment for 3 weeks. He listened to the overnight crew talk about their lives, their kids, their car payments, their hopes for the weekend, the kind of conversation that never happened in the boardroom, raw and unfiltered and real in a way that his professional world almost never was. He watched how people treated the maintenance staff, the small courtesies and the casual dismissals, and filed every observation away. He was looking for something, though he could not have said precisely what. He would know it when he saw it. That was the only hypothesis he had going in, and it was not much, but it was enough. What he did not find, in 3 weeks of searching, was the thing he was looking for. The people he met were decent enough, mostly, but nobody stopped him in a hallway and said, "Hey, tell me about yourself." Nobody asked his name who was not required to for a work order. He was furniture, useful, present, and essentially invisible. It was exactly what he had suspected and somehow still disappointing. He had begun to think seriously about ending the experiment, putting the uniform away, going back to the penthouse, and making peace with the conclusion that the fog was permanent and some things simply could not be seen through. And then it was a Tuesday night in November, and he was driving home from a double shift in a gray Honda Civic on a rain-soaked highway, and a black SUV came out of nowhere. The impact was on the driver's side. The physics of it were such that the car did not just spin, it lifted, and the rolling happened fast, 1.5 full rotations before the guardrail stopped it. Grant's last coherent thought during the crash itself was a strange, almost detached observation that the seatbelt was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was the kind of thought that the engineering-focused part of his brain produced under duress. And then there was the guardrail, and then there was stillness, and then there was the rain, and then there was nothing. He came back to consciousness in stages. First the sound, rain on broken glass, a distant car horn, then the pain, which was significant and immediate, radiating from his ribs and his left temple and his left shoulder where it had hit the door. Then the smell of gasoline, faint but there, which is a smell that the brain registers as danger even before conscious thought catches up. He tried to move. He could move, which was something. His left arm responded slowly, and his right side was largely pinned against what had been the car door and was now largely the ground. He was upside down. The seatbelt was still holding him. He could hear his own breathing, unsteady but present. He was alive. He could not immediately assess by how much. He does not remember hearing Ruby arrive. What he remembers, and what he has described in the one brief interview he gave about the accident, is a flashlight cutting through the broken passenger window and a voice, calm and clear and oddly authoritative for someone who had clearly just been running, saying his cover name, saying, "Gary, can you hear me? Stay still, do not move your neck." He remembers the beam of the flashlight. He remembers the sound of safety glass being carefully pushed away from the window frame. He remembers a hand reaching through, not grabbing, just resting on his forearm for a moment, steady and deliberate, the way you touch someone to let them know you are there. Ruby Hayes was 29 years old on the night she found Grant Caldwell's car on Highway 70 East. She had been walking the highway shoulder for almost 40 minutes, a route she had come to know well over the past several months, because it kept her out of the sections of downtown Nashville where certain individuals had been known to harass people sleeping rough. She had a small backpack, a flashlight with batteries she had bought that afternoon, a water bottle, half a granola bar, and the knowledge that the overnight shelter on Jefferson Street did not open its overflow beds until midnight. She had about an hour to fill. She was filling it by walking. To understand Ruby Hayes fully, you have to go back, further back than the highway and further back than the park bench where she had been sleeping, all the way back to a small apartment in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where she grew up, the only child of a woman named Carol Hayes. Carol was not a bad person. She was not cruel, not abusive, not the kind of mother who makes for easy, clean villains in a story. She was something harder to describe and in some ways harder to forgive. She was absent, not physically, most of the time, but in every way that counted. Carol Hayes was somewhere else. She had grown up hard herself, had made a series of decisions in her 20s that had consequences she spent the rest of her life managing, and the managing had taken everything she had. There was simply nothing left over for Ruby. So Ruby raised herself, largely. She cooked for herself from the age of 9. She got herself to school. She did her homework at the library because the apartment was too loud and too unpredictable. She was not a sad child, which is the thing about Ruby that everyone who knew her as a girl seemed to want to make clear. She was not sad. She was competent. There is a difference. Sad children wait for rescue. Competent children stop waiting and start managing. Ruby was managing by the time most kids were still asking their parents to tie their shoes. She was also, from a very young age, the person other people leaned on. The kid at school who noticed when someone was upset and sat with them. The teenager who walked her elderly neighbor's dog when the neighbor's hip was bad. The young woman who, at 18, got a part-time job at a pharmacy and learned to help customers understand their prescriptions because the pharmacist was always rushed and the customers were often confused, and Ruby could not stand watching someone walk out with medication they did not understand how to take. She had this gift, or this instinct, call it what you will, for seeing when someone needed something and providing it before they had to ask. When she was 20, she was accepted into the nursing program at Vanderbilt University on a partial scholarship. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement for someone from her background. She moved to Nashville, found a roommate, got a part-time job waiting tables, and threw herself into her studies with the kind of focus that her professors found remarkable. She was not the student who was naturally brilliant. She was the student who was up at 5 studying, who came to office hours, who treated clinical rotations not as requirements to satisfy, but as opportunities to absorb every skill she possibly could. She was going to be a good nurse. Everyone who worked with her knew it. She knew it too. And then, 18 months into her second year, her mother called. Carol Hayes had, over the course of the preceding decade, accumulated a significant debt with a private lending operation that did not operate through banks or report to credit agencies, the kind of debt that accrues interest at rates that are not legal and is collected by people who are not polite. The people had found Carol's current address. They had been to the apartment twice. Carol was frightened in a way she had never allowed herself to be frightened before, and frightened Carol Hayes did what she had always done when she ran out of options. She called Ruby. Ruby came. Of course she came. She withdrew everything from her savings account. She sold her car. She took on extra shifts at the restaurant. She moved her mother into her apartment over her roommate's understandable objections. She negotiated, in person, with people who were not accustomed to being negotiated with by a 22-year-old nursing student, and she was calm and methodical and specific, and after 3 months she had paid enough of the debt to make them go away. She had also spent most of that semester missing classes, and the missed classes had consequences, and the consequences required medical withdrawals and appeals and paperwork, and by the time all of it was sorted, she was behind in her program by a full year and flat broke. She applied for emergency financial aid. She was told the fund had been exhausted for the semester. She applied for a student loan increase. She was told her debt-to-income ratio made her ineligible. She went back to waiting tables full-time and told herself she would take 1 semester off and re-enroll in the spring. She told herself that for 2 years. During those 2 years, Carol Hayes, debt resolved and crisis past, drifted back into her old patterns of distance and unavailability, and eventually stopped returning Ruby's calls with any regularity. Ruby's roommate, unable to keep covering the full rent, had to let the apartment go. Ruby moved to a smaller place alone. The smaller place became untenable when her hours at the restaurant were cut. The restaurant downturn became a layoff. The layoff became 3 weeks of burning through her last savings. And then one morning she packed her most essential things into a backpack and walked out of an apartment she could no longer afford and into the strange, suspended, invisible world of homelessness. She had been on the street, in various degrees, for 9 months by the time she found Grant Caldwell's car. And in those 9 months, here is what she had not done. She had not stopped caring for people. She had not hardened herself into someone who looked away. Every medical instinct she had developed in 2 years of nursing school was still active, still present, still absolutely operational. She had used it twice in those 9 months. Once for an older man in a park who was showing signs of a diabetic episode, and once for a young woman at the shelter who was running a fever that Ruby recognized immediately as requiring more than ibuprofen. In both cases, she had intervened. In both cases, she had been right. In neither case had she received so much as a formal thank you. She was not bitter about that. That is the important thing to understand about Ruby Hayes. She was not bitter. She was tired, yes. She was frustrated by a situation that she knew was not her fault, but that the world showed very little interest in helping her resolve. She had hope that was not naive, but that also refused, against all reasonable evidence, to go out entirely. And she had this quality that some people are simply born with and cannot be trained out of, this quality of being fully present with whoever needed her. She could not help it. She had never been able to help it. It was the core of who she was. So when she saw the car against the guardrail, she ran. She did not think about whether it was safe. She did not think about her own situation or the complications of being homeless and having no ID and being found at an accident scene at midnight. She ran because there was a person in that car, and the person might need help, and she was the person who had shown up. That was simply the equation. It was not heroism, at least not the kind that requires a decision. It was just Ruby Hayes being exactly herself. She reached the car in under a minute. The driver's door was crushed and inaccessible. She went to the passenger side, swept the broken glass from the window frame with her sleeve, shone her flashlight in, and began her assessment. The man inside was conscious, barely. Significant laceration above the left temple, actively bleeding. Possible rib fractures given the deformation of the door. No visible signs of spinal injury from the positioning, but she could not rule it out. She talked to him the entire time, keeping her voice steady and even, telling him to stay still, telling him she was there, telling him help was coming, even before she knew for certain that it was. There was no cell service at that particular stretch of highway. She had no phone anyway. She stood up and moved to the middle of the road and used her flashlight to flag down the first set of headlights she saw, which turned out to be a long-haul truck driver named Walt who was 18 hours into a Memphis to Knoxville run and who had the enormous good sense to stop immediately and call 911 without asking any unnecessary questions. She returned to the car. She maintained pressure on the wound. She talked to Grant. She talked to this man she knew only as the driver of a car she had found, through every single minute until the ambulance arrived. When the paramedics got there and began their work, one of them paused to look at her and said, "You've done this before." She said, "Yes, a little." He nodded and said, "You did good." She said, "Thank you." When the second paramedic asked for her name and contact information for the report, she gave her first name and said she did not have a current address, and the paramedic was processing the scene and did not push it. She picked up her backpack, which she had set against the guardrail, and she walked back the way she had come. She did not stay to watch the ambulance leave. She already knew he was going to be okay. She had known that within the first 3 minutes of her assessment, he was going to be okay, and she had done what she came to do, and the shelter on Jefferson Street was still 20 minutes away on foot. She was almost at the exit ramp when she heard, faint over the rain and the idling ambulance engine, a voice behind her. She stopped. She turned. Through the paramedics and the equipment and the chaos, she could see that he was conscious now, properly conscious, being strapped to the gurney, and he was looking in her direction. She could not hear what he said from that distance, but she saw the paramedic near him look up and follow his gaze toward the highway shoulder where she was standing. She turned back around and kept walking. Grant Caldwell was taken to Nashville General Hospital. He had 3 fractured ribs on his left side, a grade 2 concussion, and a laceration above his temple that required 11 stitches. He was also, according to the attending physician who assessed him on arrival, extraordinarily lucky. The initial positioning of the car after the rollover, combined with the seatbelt holding him clear of the crumpled door panel, had prevented the kind of crushing injuries that the crash physics would have suggested were likely. Someone had also maintained pressure on the head wound with sufficient consistency to prevent the blood loss from becoming critical. The attending physician, who had been in emergency medicine for 22 years, made a note in the record that the first responder on scene appeared to have had medical training. Frank Odom was at the hospital within 40 minutes of the crash. He had been monitoring Grant's GPS as a condition of the experiment, which Grant had allowed only because it was the compromise that made Frank willing to participate at all. Frank had seen the signal stop moving on the highway and had been in his car within 90 seconds. He arrived at the hospital with the expression of a man who had been right about everything he had warned against and was taking absolutely no satisfaction from it. He stood in the hallway outside Grant's room and made 4 phone calls, 2 of which Grant never found out the full contents of. The first thing Grant said when Frank came into the room was, "Do not tell me I told you so." Frank said he would not tell him that. Then he stood there in silence for a moment and said, "Someone ran you off that road." Grant looked at him. Frank showed him the preliminary image from a traffic camera at an interchange 2 miles back, a black SUV accelerating to close the gap between itself and a gray Civic. The footage was not conclusive on its own, but it was not nothing. Grant looked at the image for a long time. Then he said, "Find out who she is. The woman who stayed with the car. Find her." Frank said he would. And then he said, "The other thing first." Grant said yes, the other thing first, but find her. Frank began both investigations simultaneously. The identification of Ruby Hayes took 48 hours. Hospital security footage from the entrance where the ambulance had arrived. Walt the truck driver's statement, which included a description and a partial first name. A cross-reference with Vanderbilt's inactive student records that Frank's contact at a private investigations firm ran as a favor. Her name came back clean. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants. Nothing that would explain why a former nursing student with her academic record was living without a permanent address. Frank put the full workup in a thin folder and left it on Grant's hospital tray on day 3. The second investigation took longer and revealed things that Frank had suspected but needed to verify carefully before he brought them to Grant. The black SUV involved in the accident had been captured on 2 additional cameras between the Caldwell Technologies parking structure and the highway on-ramp. The access log for the Caldwell Technologies parking structure showed a single key card entry at the relevant time. The key card was assigned to Derek Caldwell. This alone was not conclusive. Derek had a vehicle of his own and occasionally parked it there. But Frank went further, because Frank always went further. He pulled Derek's financial records through a contact at a forensic accounting firm, which required a level of authorization that Grant had preemptively granted Frank for exactly this kind of situation, and what the forensic accountant found was not a coincidence. Over a period of 4 years, Derek Caldwell had been redirecting small but consistent sums from a Caldwell Technologies subsidiary into a privately held shell company registered in Delaware. The transfers were structured carefully, kept below the automatic flagging thresholds, routed through enough intermediate accounts to obscure the path to a casual observer. But a forensic accountant is not a casual observer. The total, by conservative estimate, was between $9 and $11 million. Derek had been stealing from his brother's company for 4 years, and someone had already reported it. An anonymous tip had been filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission 6 weeks before the accident, containing detailed and accurate financial records that could only have come from someone with either deep internal access or an extraordinary ability to reconstruct the paper trail from publicly available information. Frank's investigator traced the digital fingerprint of the anonymous submission through 3 different methods. It came back each time to the same IP address: a Vanderbilt University network node, a student login account that had been inactive for 2 years. The account belonged to Ruby Hayes. Grant was discharged from the hospital on day 4 against the mild objections of his attending physician, who noted that his blood pressure was still slightly elevated and that he was showing the classic signs of a person who intended to go straight back to work and ignore their concussion symptoms. Grant confirmed this assessment was accurate and signed the discharge forms. Frank drove him downtown, not to the penthouse, not to the office, but, on Grant's instruction, to the park on 5th Avenue. He found Ruby on the same bench where she had spent most of the previous 4 mornings. She was reading a worn paperback, a mystery novel with a library sticker on the spine that she had found in a donation box outside a church on Charlotte Avenue. She had a paper coffee cup from the cart near the park entrance, which meant she had spent one of her remaining dollars on it, which she did maybe once a week as a deliberate small act of normalcy. She looked up when she heard footsteps on the path. She saw a man in a sling, a bandage on his left temple, wearing clothes that were slightly too nice for the park, but not so nice that they announced anything in particular. She looked at the bandage for a moment. She looked at the sling. She said, "You look terrible." He sat down on the bench. Not at the other end, not at a cautious distance, but close enough to talk normally. He said she had saved his life. She said he would have done the same. He said he was not sure he would have. There was a pause after that, a pause that was longer than most people would have been comfortable with, and Ruby let it sit there without filling it, which was not something most people did, and which registered with him the way things always registered with Grant Caldwell, quietly and precisely, and without being forgotten. He did not tell her who he was. He had the folder in the car. He had read it. He knew she knew the name Grant Caldwell, had in fact filed a federal disclosure that named Caldwell Technologies specifically. But he had also read the timeline carefully, and the timeline told him that the disclosure had been filed 6 weeks before the accident, which meant that if she had connected Gary Cole to Grant Caldwell at the time of the crash, she had made that connection on her own, in the dark, on a wet highway, while simultaneously managing an emergency medical situation. He found that either impossible or remarkable, and he had learned over the years that the things his brain initially classified as impossible usually turned out to be remarkable. So he sat with the uncertainty. He told her his name was Gary. He told her he did maintenance work. He told her he had been driving home from a double shift. All of these things were technically true. She told him her name was Ruby. She did not offer her last name. He did not ask. They talked for an hour that first morning, which surprised both of them. Ruby talked about the paperback, about why she liked mysteries, about how there was something satisfying about a narrative in which the chaos was eventually explained. Grant talked about growing up in Dayton, which he had not talked about in years with anyone, describing his father and the steel mill and the way the shift change whistle had become the metronome of his entire childhood. Ruby listened the way she did everything else, completely, attentively, without waiting for her turn to speak. When he stood up to leave, she said, "You should be taking it easier than you are." He said he would try. She said he probably would not. but okay. He almost smiled. Almost. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. He brought 2 coffees from the cart. She did not protest the coffee, which he noted. She told him later, much later, that she had decided to let it go because he looked like someone who needed to do something useful, and buying 2 coffees was useful enough to leave alone. That reasoning was so precisely Ruby that when he heard it, he had to look away for a moment. Over 3 weeks, Grant, as Gary, became a constant in Ruby's daily orbit. They walked along the Cumberland River in the early afternoons when the weather allowed. They sat in the park and talked through long stretches of the morning. He listened to her talk about nursing school with the specific kind of concentrated attention he usually reserved for acquisition meetings, which he recognized as significant. She talked about her professors, about the clinical rotations, about the particular satisfaction of being in a room with someone who needed medical help and having the tools to provide it. She talked about it the way people talk about a calling rather than a career, and the loss of it, the incompleteness of it, sat just beneath the surface of everything she said about it, present but not dominant, the way a healed fracture shows up on an X-ray. There but not in charge. She talked about her mother too, which was more complicated, and which she did with the careful, measured language of someone who has spent a lot of time trying to be fair to a person who did not always make fairness easy. She was not angry at Carol. Or rather, she had been angry and had moved through it and come out the other side with something more nuanced and harder to name, a kind of sad clarity. Carol was not going to change. Ruby had stopped needing her to. That was as resolved as it was going to get. She did not say any of this directly. But Grant heard it, because Grant had spent most of his adult life learning to hear the things people communicated in the space between their words, and what Ruby communicated in that space was a kind of hard-won self-possession that he had not encountered often. She never asked him for anything. In 3 weeks, she did not once ask him for money, for help, for a favor, for a contact, for anything at all. When he offered to get more coffee, she said, "1 is enough? Thank you." When he suggested they grab food from the cart nearby, she said she was fine, but he should go ahead if he wanted to. When he offered his jacket on a cold morning, she said she had her own and pulled it tighter. He noticed all of it. He cataloged all of it. He was aware that this was exactly the behavior the experiment had been designed to test, and he was also aware, with increasing clarity, that the experiment had stopped being the point some time ago. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week, she noticed that his color was off. She made him sit down. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist without asking permission, checked his pulse with the focus of someone taking a real reading, and told him his heart rate was elevated and that he was still showing concussion symptoms and that he was clearly pushing himself too hard. He said he was very good at pushing himself. She said that was obvious and was not a compliment. She looked at him for a moment with that direct, steady look she had, the one that did not flinch and did not perform and did not want anything from him. Just looked, and she said, "I have not figured out yet what you are pretending about." He said that was an odd thing to say. She said she did not think so. And then she opened her paperback, and he sat there for another hour and thought about what she had said and what she had meant and how long it had been since anyone had looked at him with no agenda at all. He drove back to the penthouse that evening and sat in the dark for a long time. Then he turned on the lights and called Frank and said, "I need to know everything about what she filed and when and what she knew." Frank came over and walked him through the full picture of the SEC disclosure, the timeline, the Vanderbilt IP address, the forensic accounting trail on Derek. Grant sat across the table and listened to all of it and did not interrupt once, which Frank recognized as the sign that he was processing something significant. When Frank was finished, Grant asked one question. Did she know who Gary Cole was, or did she just know who Grant Caldwell was? Frank said he did not know for certain. Grant said he needed to find out for certain, directly, and that he was going to do it himself. The morning he came to the park in his real clothes, his real suit, with Frank standing at a professional distance near the park entrance, Ruby looked up from her book and saw him walking toward her, and her expression did not change, which told him something. Because when people recognize you as someone they have been deceiving, or someone they have been deceived by, their face almost always gives it away in the first moment before they manage it. Ruby's face did not change. She watched him walk toward her with the same open, present attention she gave everything. He sat down. He said, "You knew who I was." She said, "I knew who Grant Caldwell was. I did not know Gary." He said that was a very careful answer. She said he wanted to talk about careful answers. And then she told him. She told him about a job she had taken briefly, 8 months earlier, doing data entry for a financial research service that aggregated public corporate records. She told him about seeing a pattern in the subsidiary transaction records that struck her as wrong, that she had flagged it to a supervisor who dismissed it, that she had spent 3 weeks following the paper trail on her own time, and that when she was sure, she had filed the disclosure anonymously through the SEC's online portal using the university network login she still had access to. Because her own email was unreliable and the university login was the most secure account she had. She told him she had not known that Derek Caldwell was Grant Caldwell's brother when she filed it. She had found that connection afterward, and by then the disclosure was already submitted and there was nothing to change. She told him she had not connected Gary Cole to Grant Caldwell on the night of the accident. She had been managing an emergency, and his name had not been in her mind at all. She had connected them afterward, when she heard from another woman at the shelter who had read a brief news item about a car accident involving a Caldwell Technologies executive, and she had sat with that information for 3 days trying to decide what to do with it. She had decided to do nothing because she did not know whether he knew about the SEC disclosure, did not know how he would react, did not know if he would believe her account of how it had happened, and did not want to lose the mornings at the park, which were the best part of her days, to the kind of complicated, freighted conversation that the truth was going to require. She said this last part plainly and without apology, and Grant thought about it for a moment and said, "So you lied to protect the friendship." She said she had not lied. She had just not offered information that he had not asked for. He said that was a very careful answer. She looked at him and said, "I know." And for the first time in that conversation, she almost smiled. He sat there on that bench in his $1,000 suit and his expensive shoes and his real name and his real life. And he thought about the question he had written on the yellow legal pad at 2 in the morning. If he had nothing, would anyone choose him? And he thought about 3 weeks of mornings on a bench with a woman who had known who he was and had chosen, anyway, to see only Gary. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the experiment, just the man on the bench who looked like he needed someone to talk to. Derek Caldwell was arrested 14 weeks after the accident, on 2 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of wire fraud, following an SEC investigation that had been significantly accelerated by the quality and specificity of the anonymous disclosure filed from the Vanderbilt IP address. His lawyers negotiated aggressively, as lawyers do when the evidence is substantial and the client is difficult. The trial took 11 months. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Derek was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison. He served 2.5 before a sentence reduction for cooperation with a parallel investigation into the lending institution his fraud had been tied to. He and Grant have not spoken since the arrest. Grant did not attend the trial. He had said everything he needed to say to Derek the morning after finding out, which was 2 sentences delivered in his office with the door closed, and then he had gone back to running his company. The question of whether Derek had ordered the accident, whether the black SUV on Highway 70 East that night had been deliberate, was investigated separately and inconclusively. The SUV was never recovered. The driver was never identified. The access log tied Derek to the parking structure but proved nothing about where he went afterward. Frank remained convinced, privately, that it was not a coincidence. Grant told Frank that he chose not to spend time on questions he could not answer, which was true and also a way of not saying that the alternative answer was one he was not prepared to sit with. Ruby Hayes re-enrolled in Vanderbilt's nursing program in the spring semester, 8 months after the morning on the bench when everything came out. The re-enrollment was made possible by a significant anonymous donation to the university's emergency financial aid fund, donated in a way that was genuinely untraceable, routed through a community foundation that Grant had supported for years, designated for distribution to students who had experienced documented interruptions due to family hardship. Ruby was awarded a full grant covering her remaining tuition and living expenses. She did not find out about the donation until 6 months into her first semester back, when a financial aid administrator, moved by her story and not entirely aware of the confidentiality parameters involved, mentioned that her case had been specifically cited in the donation documentation. She called Grant. It was the angriest she had ever sounded with him, not screaming, not cruel, but direct in a way that left no room for negotiation. She said he should have asked her what she needed. He said he knew. He said he was still learning. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You could have just asked." He said yes. She said, "Next time ask." He said there would not be a next time because she was back in school, and that had been the point. She said that was not the point she was making. He said he understood. She said she was not sure he did. He said maybe she could explain it to him over coffee. She said 1 coffee. He said of course. She said she meant it. He said he believed her. It was 2 coffees. Ruby Hayes completed her nursing degree and passed her licensing exam on the first attempt. She is currently working as a registered nurse at Vanderbilt Medical Center in Nashville, in the cardiac care unit, which her supervising physician has described as a placement so natural it seems like the unit had been waiting for her. She has a 1-bedroom apartment with large south-facing windows and a cat named Biscuit, which is the same name she gave a cat in her old apartment before everything fell apart. Because some things, when you get them back, you name the same way you named them the first time. She sends money to her mother occasionally. Carol calls more often than she used to. It is not a perfect relationship. It is a real one, which Ruby has decided is better. Grant Caldwell still runs Caldwell Technologies, which has continued to grow and is currently expanding into 3 new markets. He still takes the stairs. His employees find it slightly unnerving to round a stairwell corner and encounter the CEO walking up 5 flights with a coffee, but they have mostly adjusted. He sold the penthouse and bought a house in East Nashville, a neighborhood he chose specifically because it is the kind of place where the man at the coffee shop knows your name and the hardware store still has a front porch with a couple of chairs on it. He has not fully figured out how to be a person in the world in the way that comes naturally to Ruby, but he is working on it, which, for a man who spent most of his life behind a very well-constructed door, is significant. Frank Odom still works for him. He has declined to say "I told you so" in a consistent and principled fashion for the entire duration of the story. He did, on one occasion, over a late dinner after the Derrick sentencing, allow himself to observe that if Grant had simply asked him to arrange a normal date like a normal person, none of the preceding events would have been necessary. Grant told him that was almost certainly true. Frank said almost. Grant said fair enough. Here is what I want to leave you with, and I want you to sit with this for a moment before you scroll away. Grant Caldwell built an experiment to find out if anyone would love him without the money, and what the experiment ultimately revealed was not what he had designed it to test. It did not tell him whether a woman could see past his wealth. It told him something harder and more important. It told him that the person he had hidden under the money, the man from Dayton, the son of Raymond and Barbara, the boy who counted to 4 in doorways and wrote honest questions in notebooks at 2 in the morning, that person was someone worth being seen. Ruby Hayes did not save Grant Caldwell on the highway. She had already saved something in him before that, something that had been closed for a long time. The accident just made it impossible for either of them to pretend it had not happened. And Ruby Hayes, who lost almost everything trying to take care of a mother who could not take care of her back, who spent 9 months sleeping rough and never lost the instinct to run towards someone in trouble, who filed a federal disclosure because something was wrong, and that was reason enough. Ruby did not need saving in the way that word usually gets used in stories like this one. She needed a door to open, and she walked through it herself on her own 2 feet the moment someone unlocked it. She would have gotten there eventually. She always would have gotten there. Grant just happened to be there when she did. There is something in this story about what it means to be seen. Really seen. Not the biography, not the bank account, not the narrative the world has built around you, but the actual person underneath all of that. The one who shows up even when showing up is inconvenient and nobody is watching and there is nothing in it for you. Ruby had been showing up her whole life. Grant had been showing up in every way except the one that counted. And somewhere on a bench in a Nashville park, over coffee that cost about $1.50, they recognized that quality in each other. That recognition, that moment of being actually known by another person, turns out to be something that $340 million cannot buy. But it turns out it is available on a park bench, early on a cold morning, if you have the courage to sit down and stop pretending. So I want to ask you something before you go. And I genuinely mean this. I want you to think about it and leave your answer in the comments because I read them and because this question matters. If you were Ruby, knowing what she knew, would you have told him the truth sooner? Or would you have done exactly what she did, protected the ordinary mornings for as long as you could, held on to the version of things where he was just Gary and you were just Ruby, and the whole complicated truth could wait a little longer? Because I think how you answer that question says something real about how you understand the trade-off between honesty and the fragile, irreplaceable thing that trust is before it gets tested. If this story moved you in any way, please drop a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you. Tell us what you would have done differently. Tell us where you are watching from, because we genuinely love knowing who is on the other end of these stories. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do, because every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about real human beings navigating the distance between who they are and who they have let the world believe them to be. Those are the only stories worth telling. And we are not going anywhere.